Hey guys. Originally I said that I planned to do a video covering all 6 of the new Evolve Stage 2 exclusive characters. Well, I say new, they came out in 2016, but you know, to me they're new, I've never been able to play them before until now. However, as you can see, this video is just a video on Renegade Abe, one of the 6. And the reason for that is that I originally did make an entire video on all 6 at once. I actually did fully edit that video and actually upload it to my YouTube just privately, and I was waiting to make it public to upload it. However, in the run-up to doing that, I realized more and more I was kind of unsatisfied with the video. First of all, doing all 6 in one video, it came out to 54 minutes abouts, which wasn't egregiously long, but was a bit longer than I was hoping. But it kind of makes sense. I am covering 6 whole characters in one video, even if it is mostly a first impressions thing. And because it was mostly first impressions and I realized I wasn't going to have the most nuanced take on the characters right from the start, I thought I'd be fine with the fact that maybe my opinions wouldn't be perfect, but it's just what I think of the characters having, you know, just played them. However, there were enough characters that I very quickly changed my opinion on quite drastically that I thought it was worth redoing this. And I think that what I want to do instead is I want to cover the characters that I really think there's a lot to say about in their own videos, and then I'll cover the rest all in one video, the other ones that I feel like there isn't so much to say about. Because I did find that some of the characters I had a lot to say about, and some of the characters I had very little to say about. All that said, Evolve Stage 2 has 6 exclusive characters that aren't in Legacy. Now, all of these characters for the most part are kind of lower effort than the characters in Legacy, in fairness, because they're all variants and they all came late into the game's life when already it was kind of on the decline, so it kind of makes sense that these characters aren't necessarily the most high quality. That being said, they're still new characters in a game that I absolutely love, so of course I still wanted to try them out. A lot of them have designs that look interesting right off the bat, but also look like they kind of don't fit. Especially Electro Griffin, that's probably the worst offender. You can just look at this and be like, what the fuck is this doing here? However, it's not all bad. Just because they don't have the most effort put into them doesn't mean that all of them are bad. In fact, some of them are very, very good. And as well as that, we don't just have variants here, we have variants that actually swap classes. And that's going to be the topic of this video, Renegade Abe. A variant of Abe, who was usually a trapper, who actually turns him into an assault. And the reason that I'm covering Renegade Abe before any other variant in the game is because, quite honestly, he is by far the best Stage 2 exclusive character. It's not even close. Because despite most of the Stage 2 exclusive characters clearly being a little bit lazy, Renegade Abe truly does feel like a completely unique character despite being built from Abe. And on top of that, I genuinely consider him to be the most fun assault in the entire game, and it makes me sad that he's not in Legacy. So yeah, that's some pretty high praise, so he's definitely the best out of the 6. Let's get into why. Renegade Abe has a super satisfying kit, where you're constantly swapping weapons and never stuck on the same thing. Unlike almost every other assault in the game, who usually has a main weapon which is their main source of damage, there are very few assaults where you aren't heavily encouraged to spam the same weapon. Renegade Abe takes the same shotgun, dart, and grenade that Abe has, but of course changes their purposes. The tracking dart becomes a nerve toxin dart, the stasis grenades, which aren't really even grenades in the first place, more like balls which slow the monster down when they touch it and don't explode, are now replaced with corrosive grenades which do explode and explode into pools of acid. And we have the shotgun, which becomes penitence, which is also a shotgun, it's just the edgier shotgun. At first, I could definitely see why they made Abe into an assault, because already Trapper Abe has a pretty damn good weapon to say he's a trapper. His shotgun can fire pretty damn fast, and honestly, he's easily the best damage in the trapper class. But I was surprised to see that the way they turned his shotgun into an assault's weapon isn't by making it shoot even faster or have even more ammo. They actually reduced its ammo all the way down to 2, so you have to reload it with this a lot more often. However, of course, they increased the damage to compensate. They also removed the option for you to be able to ADS while using the weapon, to instead give you an alt fire when you right click. The alt fire will fire both barrels at once, which will deal more damage but will have less accuracy, and it will lose the poison effect that this weapon has on its left click. Then you've got the corrosive grenades, which when they hit the monster reduce the damage that they're able to do to your teammates for a few seconds, while also making it so they take poison damage. And finally, the nerve toxin dart, which of course poisons the monster, but also makes them take increased damage from all sources. Now already this kit was really fun because of how much you constantly have to swap off to new weapons, whereas other assaults tend to stick on the same weapon a lot of the time, especially ones like Hyde. Renegade Abe only has 2 shots in his shotgun, 1 shot of his nerve toxin dart, and quote-unquote 1 shot of his corrosive grenades. I mean, I guess you don't really reload those, but it takes so long to get a new one, you may as well be reloading. As a result, to avoid having too much downtime, you're swapping weapons a lot on Renegade Abe. And because you have so many debuffs to juggle, it gives you a lot to think about when playing him, making him an assault which really takes a lot more brain power than most of them, which is probably what I appreciate about him. I would say he's definitely one of the hardest assaults in the game to play properly. Although that being said, it is pretty hard to top the difficulty of Torvald's Mortar Cannon or Lennox's Plasma Lance. Although in fairness, for those characters, that's just one thing they have to learn. It's just that that one thing has to be learned to do very, very well. Either way, when I first played Renegade Abe, I was playing them very, very wrong. I mean, I was having fun, but I was doing something very wrong, and that was refreshing the debuffs too often. I didn't know how long the debuffs last, and unfortunately, the game doesn't indicate it very clearly. And so I just kept refreshing the debuffs whenever I could. Anytime my shotgun was reloading, I would refresh the nerve toxin dart and the corrosive grenades and then go back to the shotgun. Fire off some shots, it's reloading, go back to the nerve toxin, and then the corrosive grenades, and then the shotgun. And while it certainly is good to refresh debuffs while reloading, there's not much point in doing it if the debuffs aren't even anywhere near out of time. At that point, I'm just severely reducing my DPS because I'm being overly cautious. I also didn't know if the poison from each of your weapons was a different kind of poison, or whether every time I hit the monster with any weapon, I was just refreshing the same kind of poison. And lastly, I didn't know how significant the damage reduction and damage amplification debuffs were. And so, I for once decided to go to the wiki and start crunching some numbers to figure out how I'm supposed to play this character. And what I found was a mixed bag. One bad news, 2 good news. The one bad news was that the damage reduction and damage increase was much smaller than I expected. The damage reduction especially was very disappointing, only being a 5% damage reduction. I knew it couldn't be that high, but I thought it would at least be something like 10%. 5% is honestly kind of pathetic, and the damage amplification is a 7.5% boost, which still isn't very high, but I wouldn't quite call it pathetic considering that is to all points on the monster, and we don't really have much in the game that's able to amplify the damage on the monster. I mean, we have the damage amp from Kaba, of course, and we have, of course, the weak spots from Val, Lazarus, and Torvald. However, you don't tend to land all of your shots on those weak spots, so it's kind of hard to compare it to the weak spots, because we don't know how often you land the shots on the weak spots and get the benefit. But I guess for the sake of comparison, Lazarus's weak spots provide a 15% boost to damage, Val's provide a 35% boost, and Torvald's provide a 50% boost. That's the bad news out of the way. Here comes the 2 series of good news though. One of them is that the debuffs last way longer than I thought. They last 10 whole seconds, both from the corrosive grenade and the nerve toxin dart, which means that I was swapping way too often. If you've got reload speed and swap speed perks on as Renegade Abe, then you're able to get 4 shotgun shots in before you need to swap back to your nerve toxin dart or corrosive grenade to reapply debuffs on the monster. And before, I was literally only doing 1, sometimes 2. So I was missing out on a lot of damage by swapping far too often. The other good news, as it turns out, all 3 weapons have a different poison damage over time which does stack. Once again, the corrosive grenades and the nerve toxin darts both last 10 seconds, and the shotgun's poison lasts 5 seconds. The DPS of them all is 10 DPS for the corrosive grenades, 17 DPS for the poison on the shotgun, and 28 DPS for the poison on the nerve toxin dart. When you add that all together, if you've got all 3 kinds of poison on the monster at once, they're taking 55 damage per second even if you're not shooting them. And that's before damage amplification as well. As a side note, I also wanted to figure out if right clicks were worth it or not. I did find them very satisfying to use, but I couldn't shake the feeling they weren't that effective. And unfortunately, I was kind of right. There are still circumstances where the right click is worth it, but they're very niche. If every pellet of your shotgun connects, and if we ignore headshots because that kind of complicates things, the maximum amount of damage you can do from a normal shot from Penitence, ignoring the poison over time damage, would be 140 damage. So getting 2 of those is 280 damage. The right click will use both of those bullets and have no poison while being less accurate to deal 256 damage at maximum. So yeah, for the same amount of bullets, you're getting less damage and no poison and less accuracy. Now, in fairness, it's not a whole lot less damage, and the fact that you'll be able to fire off both shots at once rather than having to wait to fire off the second shot does mean that you are able to technically deal a burst of damage faster. Thanks to being able to empty the clip faster, taking into account reload time, you actually can deal very, very slightly more DPS with perfect right clicks as opposed to perfect left clicks, assuming that you already have the monster poisoned anyway. However, when I say very, 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 very slightly more DPS, I really mean that. What I mean is that right clicks only deal literally 0.67 more DPS than left clicks, while being less accurate and not applying poison. So yeah, they have their uses. If the monster is definitely poisoned and you're right in their face and you're definitely not going to miss a single pellet, then you might as well right click because it is technically a very small amount extra damage. And as well as that, if for whatever reason you don't have time to fire off both shots, or perhaps you're able to line up a headshot, but you're only going to get one headshot, not two, then yeah, maybe the right click will be better. But of course, all these are pretty niche circumstances. In your normal circumstances, just spam left click. It's literally the same amount of damage, give or take 1 DPS, and you get the poison, and it's more accurate. Now, you might have noticed I've been crunching a lot more numbers than usual here, and you might be wondering why that is. Well, there is a good reason for it. While I love Renegade Abe, obviously, I genuinely think they're the main reason to play Stage 2 over Legacy Evolve. It really sucks being stuck with the other assaults in Legacy Evolve and not having Renegade Abe. At the same time, the popular opinion I seem to have gotten so far is that this character is not very strong. A lot of people do agree he's fun, but most people seem to think he's underwhelming. Not quite the laughingstock that Markov is, but definitely not a strong pick for an assault. And the reason for that being, quite simply, he does not deal enough damage to say that he's an assault. And I could see where they were coming from, but I never thought that Renegade Abe's damage was that much lower than the rest of the assaults. I certainly didn't expect it to be anywhere near the highest, but I thought it wasn't low enough to really drag him down, especially when he has 2 unique debuffs when the rest of the assaults in the game provide basically nothing but damage and no other utility. As well as that, because I consider him a pretty high skill assault, I also thought there was a chance that people simply didn't really learn to play him well enough to see how good his damage could be. I mean, in fairness, he was one of the last characters added to the game, and he is a Stage 2 exclusive when most fans prefer Legacy. As a result, he probably doesn't have that many people who really given a good shot to maining him. And so maybe people really never saw his potential. However, I am not going to be suddenly a Renegade Abe master any second now. I mean, I feel like I do pretty well on the character, but I'm not a god. So I thought the better way to go about this would be to theorize what the perfect damage cycle is for Renegade Abe and see how much DPS you'll do using that cycle, and then compare that to the other assaults in the game. As I've said before, the perfect cycle for damage with Renegade Abe, if everything's going perfectly, is to hit the monster with the Nerve Toxin Dart, hit them with a Corrosive Grenade, and then hit them with 8 consecutive shots from Penitence, and then repeat the cycle. That way you'll keep all 3 debuffs on the monster simultaneously without them ever wearing off, while also obviously landing as many shots as possible on your highest DPS option, that of course being your shotgun. And of course the DPS I'm going to say only counts if every pellet from your shotgun always connects and you don't miss. As well as that, I did remember to take into account poison DPS, and I did remember to take into account the damage amplification from the Nerve Toxin Dart. Adding all that up, we get about 200 DPS, give or take. But, well, as much as it's cool to know that at peak performance Renegade Abe does 200 DPS, just that on its own isn't very helpful to know. Like, what does that mean? What is 200 DPS compared to the other assaults? So this is why I really went down the number crunching rabbit hole, because I needed to also figure out the perfect damage cycles, or at least an approximation of them, for the rest of the assaults in the game so that I could compare the damage output of Renegade Abe to them, and figure out if Renegade Abe really has bad damage, or if people are just bad at Renegade Abe. And to cut a long story short, the answer that I found is it's kind of 50-50. Renegade Abe's maximum damage when being played perfectly is pretty average among the rest of the assaults on the list. However, a lot of the assaults that do have less maximum damage than him are assaults who can very easily reach their maximum damage, whereas for Renegade Abe, it's very hard for him to reach his maximum damage, and his maximum damage isn't much higher than some of those other options. So to put it in perspective, I thought the first and best target to go for would be Hyde. The way to deal maximum damage on Hyde is super simple. Literally, just use the flamethrower, and whenever the flamethrower is reloading, swap to your gas bombs. You don't have to use the minigun because it does less damage than the flamethrower unless you're landing headshots or going for weak spots, but again, that kind of complicates things. We're just assuming a monster where you never headshot them and you never use weak spots. You might be wondering whether it's more effective to use the entire clip of the flamethrower, which is very large, before reloading, or whether you should swap off the flamethrower early to refresh the gas bombs when they run out. Thankfully, I did think to check both of those things. What I came up to is that you have 190 DPS if you use the entire ammo capacity of the flamethrower before using a gas bomb. If you do that, the monster will be hit by the gas bomb 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time it won't. However, almost all times it will be getting hit by the flamethrower and taking residual burn damage, and that adds up to 190 DPS. Which is a lot, but it's not as much as Renegade Abe. So Renegade Abe does do more damage than Hyde if you play him well, but only by 10 DPS. And to achieve perfect damage with Hyde is really easy. You just need to hit the monster with the flamethrower, and then when you're reloading, throw another gas bomb, and that's it. Whereas dealing maximum damage with Renegade Abe requires you to not only use all 3 of your tools, to never miss, and also to make sure that you're close enough that all of your shotgun pellets connect every time you hit. So clearly it's a lot more effort for only a slight increase to your DPS. I was also curious how much DPS Markov does, considering of course he's considered by far the worst assault in the game. And while I expected that he was the worst assault in the game, I thought he would at least still be playable, but it seems like most of the community considers him basically unplayable. I wanted to see if the community was being too harsh on Markov, so I went to look up his numbers. Now, I didn't manage to get quite as much information on exactly how much DPS Markov could do if you're playing him perfectly, because of the fact that the wiki didn't include all the information I needed. However, the one thing that I saw, which already made me get the picture of why Markov is pretty bad, is that his lightning gun, his highest form of DPS, is only 180 DPS, which is less than Hyde and less than Renegade Abe, and on top of that, his lightning gun has a way longer recharge time than Hyde's flamethrower. Essentially, you will never be dealing more DPS than the other assaults in the game as Markov unless you're getting a lot of damage off of mines, which is certainly possible but very difficult. And even then, you will be doing all that effort just to be doing average, not even necessarily good. While I was at it, of course I didn't want to spend all day number crunching, so I simplified some of these down. So for Lennox, I just looked at what the maximum DPS you could get for the Plasma Lance is, assuming you're landing every single lance and you're already at a 4x multiplier. I found that it was 227, which is higher than Renegade Abe, but of course that's a very ideal circumstance. A circumstance in which you have all 4 charges never get interrupted and are constantly hitting more plasma lances on the monster. It's a very rare circumstance. In fact, if anything, that was a little bit less than I was expecting. It kind of makes me realize, oh damn, is Lennox even that good? I don't really know what the popular opinion is on Lennox, but I always thought they seemed pretty good. But now seeing how little damage the Plasma Lance does at maximum capacity kinda has me concerned. Again, 227 might be better than everyone we've seen so far, but not by much, and that's assuming perfect play on a weapon that is very difficult to get to its maximum potential, especially against more agile or smarter monsters. Oh yeah, and I'm kind of going to make this one click, because once again I kind of had to do a lot of estimation because I didn't get all the numbers I needed for Blitz Markov. But Blitz Markov, when being played perfectly, would be doing
160 DPS.
Which, considering it's really hard to constantly get maximum charge lightning guns with Blitz Markov, that's not very impressive. So I can see why even Blitz Markov isn't considered that good. I used to think that Markov was bad, but Blitz Markov was good. And now I can see that Blitz Markov is playable, but still not really good. Though hot damn, one fully charged arc mine from Blitz Markov is literally 1,000 damage, no joke. Anyway, that just leaves 2 assaults who are very purposely left for last, because these are the most annoying ones to figure out, but also some of the ones with the most crazy damage potential. Parnell and Torvald. So of course for Parnell, I had to get 3 different numbers. The amount of DPS you deal with Parnell without Super Soldier, the amount you deal with Super Soldier, and assuming that the monster is always within effective range and you're constantly using Super Soldier the second it comes back, what your DPS would be then. Without ever using Super Soldier, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that Parnell's DPS is pretty pitiful, and is basically the worst DPS in the class, 170. But even then, it's not a whole lot lower than Hyde, Renegade Abe, or Markov. In fact, considering that Markov isn't able to keep up his 180 DPS all the time, he might actually have more DPS than Markov even without Super Soldier, which wow, Markov really has it rough, doesn't he? With Super Soldier, it probably doesn't surprise you to learn that holy shit does that DPS shoot up. The DPS with Super Soldier is 685, which means because Super Soldier has a 33% uptime, 15-second duration, and then 30-second wait between being able to use it again, that means that you will be at 685 DPS a third of the time and 170 the rest of the time, for a total of 342 DPS on average, assuming you can use Super Soldier on cooldown and get the maximum value off of your weapons. Whoo boy! So yeah, 342 is a lot higher than everyone else we've seen. It becomes very clear why Parnell is consistently a respectable pick when you see just how high his DPS can skyrocket when he's being played well. And then there's Torvald, who is the most annoying one to calculate the damage of. Because if you just look at the numbers of his damage in pure how much the shotgun does, blah, 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 it is pretty pitiful. If you're just counting shotgun damage into mine damage while reloading the shotgun, it's 125. If you take into account weak spots and somehow assume that you always land all of your shotgun pellets in a weak spot, then it's 185 DPS. Still pretty pitiful. The second that things get crazy is when you say screw the grenades, now let's just look at the mortar. If you just swap between the shotgun and the mortar and don't count the damage amplification from the weak spots, you can get a DPS of up to 382, which is insane. But it's mostly just because the mortar damage is insane, because you're not really supposed to be able to consistently land hits on the mortar, since you have to hard predict the monster's movement to actually get them with the mortar. So yeah, Torvald's definitely the one that's the most awkward to compare people to, because technically his DPS is through the roof, but it's assuming a whole bunch of things which are never going to happen in a real game. And I'm not even going to try and calculate what the best DPS is if you actually use all three of his tools. Like if you use the mortar cannon and the shotgun and the frag mines and you use weak spot, that just gets really, really messy. And at this point, I think it's pretty clear that whatever number I'm going to come up with is going to be something that's way higher than what your actual normal DPS is on Torvald, even if you play him well. So I don't really see the point. Either way, this gives us a comparison point with everyone else. We can see that Markov by far has the worst DPS, followed by Hyde, but Hyde's highest DPS is super easy to maintain, which is why he's still considered a very powerful option, because quite simply, Hyde has to do very little to maintain that constant 190 DPS, whereas other assaults need to play perfectly to maintain their maximum DPS. And where Renegade Abe would lie would be right above Hyde. So overall, Renegade Abe's optimum DPS is pretty middle of the pack. It's just that it's very hard to maintain his optimum DPS, which obviously makes it kind of not worth it, because you're putting in all this effort just to be average in your maximum DPS. This is why I say people are half right in saying that he simply doesn't deal enough damage. But once again, if you're able to, play this all perfectly, then yeah, you will be doing maximum damage, and he will actually be doing fine for Assault, while also providing 2 debuffs, which no other Assault can provide anything like in the game. The Assaults that do better require very, very optimum circumstances, like Lennox. And the only Assault who can really consistently be able to deal more constant DPS than Renegade Abe when playing perfectly, without it being something super unrealistic that you're never going to see anyone be good enough to do, is Parnell. Playing Parnell perfectly simply requires that you land all his shotgun pellets, land all his rockets as direct hits, use Super Soldier as often as possible, always been in the effective range so that everything doesn't get any damage reduction or misses on it, and just constantly land shots and always swap whenever you run out of ammo on one weapon to the other weapon. Doing that is not necessarily easy in the middle of a game when things are often not going right at all times, but at the same time, it's a lot more feasible than some of the more ridiculous things like never missing a single mortar shot on Torvald, or always using all 6 of your mortars at the perfect timing, or constantly maintaining a maximum charge plasma lance without losing it once as Lennox. Clearly, dealing maximum damage with Parnell, while not easy, is actually realistic, and you could do it if you simply do well. And if you do that, you do have a huge DPS. Okay, I know I've been good on a while now, but this is the bottom line. I think based off of all this, it's pretty safe to say that Renegade Abe is a little underrated, but nothing crazy. he is able to keep pace with the other assaults in the game in terms of his DPS potential if you simply play him well. He just won't be going above and beyond, that is, unless you can take advantage of his debuffs. Which is where the next thing comes in, I'm going to say, which is that I think that Renegade Abe is probably a very team-dependent pick. There are some characters in this game who, despite not being assaults, are able to deal quite a lot of damage to the monster. And if you've got a team with a lot of characters like that, then Renegade Abe is probably a big pick, because of the fact that the damage amplification applies not only to you, but all of your teammates. You're getting a much more impressive effect if all 4 of your teammates are using that damage amp. However, if the rest of your team is mostly characters that are very, very poor in terms of their damage output, then you aren't going to be getting much value off of it aside from the damage you're doing yourself. And so there won't be much point in picking Renegade Abe. Funnily enough, for this reason, I imagine normal Abe would pair very well with Renegade Abe, because of the fact that normal Abe is probably the highest damage output trapper in the game. In terms of medic as well, I imagine Slim and Paladin Parnell would both be very, very effective with Renegade Abe, thanks to the fact that they get to deal increased damage when they're already pretty high damage medics, with the damage amplification from the Nerve Toxin Dart. And as for the support category, well, almost every support actually has pretty high damage output to say they're not an assault. So, you know, go crazy, whoever you think does the most damage. There is one more thing that Renegade Abe can do, though, that I think is pretty nice, that most assaults aren't very good at, that I think also makes Renegade Abe a pretty strong option, and maybe a little bit slept on. And that is that Renegade Abe, in my opinion, is the best assault when it comes to chase. Chase, of course, being when the dome comes down and the monster's trying to get away from you, simply having the ability to still stay on the tail of the monster and keep damaging it even when it's out of the dome and trying to run away from you. Eventually, it probably will get away because the monster is faster than you, so without special abilities to prevent it from escaping or to give you massive speed boosts, you probably won't be able to catch up. However, while Renegade Abe doesn't really have a tool which allows him to catch up to the monster or prevent it from getting away, he does have a lot better tools than most assaults to be able to deal a lot of damage to the monster even when they're very, very far away. Yes, his main weapon may be a shotgun, but if even one pellet of that shotgun lands, then you still get the full poison effect, which means that you can constantly be refreshing your poison DOTs on the monster despite it being a mile away. As well as that, the Nerve Toxin Dart, just like the Tracking Dart, is very, very, very accurate and very effective at long range. Lastly, the rest of your team won't get this benefit, but you will essentially be able to see the monster through walls as long as it's hit with either the Nerve Toxin Dart or another poison DOT. And the reason for that is because Stage 2 has these damage numbers that show up when you hurt the monster, and they're visible through walls, which means if the monster hides from you in a position where you should not be able to see them, if they're still taking poison damage, you'll be seeing numbers pop up wherever they're hiding. So you'll know where they've gone. So yeah, clearly I very much like this character. I think they're the best assault that the game has ever seen. And I think I made a pretty good argument to say that they're a little bit underrated. That being said, I definitely acknowledge that they're not becoming a meta pick anytime soon. If anything, this has just given me more of an appreciation for just how fucking good Parnell is. Because holy shit, man, 342 DPS just for landing shotguns and rockets and using Super Soldier well. Again, not to say that there's no skill in that, but just compared to some of the other assaults who have to do much more difficult things to reach anywhere near that number, damn, that is some value. Especially when you consider having burst damage like Parnell does, shooting his DPS all the way up to 685 while he's got Super Soldier, means that if you combine that with things like damage amp, then my god, you're going to be dealing stupid amounts of damage to the monster. Either way, that's enough for this video. You can see very much why I needed to make a separate video just for Renegade Abe. I'll see how I feel, whether any of these other ones need their own videos. But Renegade Abe was special, as I say. They were just a lot better than the other characters. Either way, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.